My husband's father told me, just hours after the funeral, that all property would revert to his blood family. He expected me to crumble, to disappear quietly. Little did they know, I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. If you have ever been underestimated or treated like you were nothing, hit subscribe. Like this video, and get ready to hear a story where patience, intelligence, and subtle revenge turned a family's assumptions upside down. Let's begin. The morning of the funeral was a blur. Black dresses, murmured condolences, and the hollow weight of loss pressed against my chest. My husband, my partner of 15 years, had passed suddenly, leaving behind grief that felt impossible to navigate. Yet, as I sat in the cold marble of the family estate, his father delivered the blow I had anticipated for years. "The property," he said, his tone final and condescending, "reverts to the blood family. You understand this, don't you?" I nodded calmly, though my mind raced. Of course, legally, they assumed I would have no claim. The family had always viewed me as an outsider, a woman who had married into wealth but was inherently disposable in their eyes. They had discounted every contribution I had made, every time I had helped manage their estates, invested in properties, and expanded their business without recognition. As his father outlined their plans, dividing assets, reallocating control, and marginalizing my position, I felt the familiar sting of dismissal and invisibility. Memories surfaced, the subtle snubs, the whispered doubts, the outright hostility I endured at every family gathering. Every moment had built toward this crescendo of assumed victory over me. But grief alone does not define me. I had always been observant, strategic, and patient. I had quietly studied legal documents, investment portfolios, and family trusts. I knew the gaps in their assumptions, the legal technicalities they had ignored. And I had already begun planning for the inevitable moment when they would underestimate me most. The house was silent except for the faint creak of the grand staircase and the whispered condolences of distant relatives. My husband's father, seated with the commanding authority he wielded so well, seemed certain that he had won. But he did not know that his so-called blood family was about to face a revelation that would leave them reeling. I remembered every slight and every dismissal, every family event where I was excluded, every opportunity where they assumed incompetence, every whisper that I was not worthy. All of it was now fuel for the reckoning I had been preparing. As I left the estate, my heart was steady. The world may have seen a grieving widow, fragile and powerless, but inside, I was plotting. Each property, each trust, each financial document was a piece of a puzzle, and I intended to solve it in a way they could never anticipate. The days after the funeral were the hardest, not for grief, but for the constant reminders that my presence was unwelcome. Every meeting, every phone call, every casual conversation with my husband's family carried the subtle weight of exclusion. Their words were carefully measured, their glances assessing, as though they were confirming what they already assumed, that I was a widow without power, a woman who had married into wealth but would soon be erased from it. I spent hours poring over legal documents, marriage contracts, and trust deeds. Each clause, each ambiguous term, was a potential lever. They had relied on assumptions, on the comfort of tradition, on the belief that I would never have the tenacity or knowledge to challenge them. They underestimated my patience, my observation, and my determination. Some nights, I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to the hollow sounds of the house settling, thinking of every slight, every dismissive gesture, every condescending word. My thoughts were not of revenge in the petty sense. They were of strategy, of ensuring that every advantage I had earned would not slip through my fingers. I cataloged every asset, every property, every hidden clause in the family, trusts that could be leveraged. My husband's father, confident in his superiority, continued to make arrangements as if the outcome were already decided. He spoke openly to relatives about my supposed lack of legal standing, the bloodline rules, and the division of property. He did not realize that every word, every assertion, only provided me with ammunition for my careful and precise response. I visited the properties in question, studying every contract, every ledger, every piece of evidence that could demonstrate my rightful claim. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how unprepared the family truly was. They had relied on their own arrogance, assuming that grief would paralyze me, that I would bow to their narrative of inheritance. There were moments when I felt the crushing weight of isolation. Family friends whispered condolences that felt more like judgment, and the casual smiles of relatives masked suspicion and curiosity. But each interaction reinforced my resolve. Every time someone implied my lack of authority or questioned my involvement, I made a mental note, cataloged it, and planned for the moment of reckoning. My husband's father continued to assert dominance, unaware that his assumptions were fragile. He underestimated the power of careful preparation, of knowledge gained quietly and deliberately over time. I began reaching out to legal advisors, financial experts, and property managers, ensuring that when the moment came, my claims would be unassailable. Every step was methodical, deliberate, and untraceable. I even observed the family's interactions with one another. Alliances, rivalries, and insecurities became tools I could use. The very people they trusted to enforce their vision of inheritance were subtly aligned with me through prior professional connections. Every conversation I overheard, every mistake they made, was a stepping stone toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Sleep came in brief bursts, often interrupted by visions of confrontation and justice. I imagined the moments when the family would realize that their assumptions about power, control, and bloodline were flawed. I imagined their expressions as I presented irrefutable evidence, as I stepped confidently into spaces they had assumed would be theirs alone. Through it all, I never lost sight of my purpose. This was not about vengeance in the destructive sense. It was about rightful acknowledgement. Every ounce of strategy, patience, and preparation was aimed at ensuring that the truth of my contributions, my knowledge, and my rightful claims could no longer be denied. By the end of these weeks, I had not only mapped the legal landscape, but had rehearsed every possible scenario. I knew their likely objections, anticipated every counter-argument, and had prepared responses that were calm, precise, and irrefutable. My inner monologue became a rehearsal space for a performance of authority, patience, and quiet triumph. The family continued to move forward with their plans, confident in their assumed victory. Invitations were sent, arrangements were finalized, and yet, every action only tightened the noose of their own assumptions. They did not see the careful threads of strategy weaving around them, the quiet storm that would soon force recognition and respect. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, I realized that the moment to act was near. The groundwork had been laid, the allies subtly informed, the documents prepared. All that remained was the execution, the final step where their arrogance and assumptions would meet reality. I paused, taking a deep breath, feeling the tension and anticipation coursing through me. The family believed they had control. They believed they had the upper hand. But in truth, every misjudgment, every dismissal, had only prepared the stage for a demonstration of calculated authority that they could never anticipate. The struggle, the sleepless nights, the cataloging of assets and weaknesses, all of it had led to this cusp of revelation. Their assumptions were fragile, their confidence misplaced. And I, poised with patience and knowledge, was ready to tip the balance in my favor. As I closed the final file on the desk, the house quiet around me, a sense of clarity washed over my mind. Every slight, every dismissal, every condescending remark had a purpose: to fuel the moment when truth and justice would prevail. And in that stillness, I realized the plan was perfect, the timing flawless, and the family's shock inevitable. The stage was set. The final act was about to begin. The following morning, I awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Sleep had been fleeting, but clarity had emerged from the chaos of grief and frustration. Every interaction with my husband's family had reinforced one undeniable truth. They believed they had all the power. They assumed that as a widow I would be isolated, uninformed, and ultimately powerless. Little did they know that power had quietly shifted, and I had been its silent architect all along. I began by reviewing every legal document with my attorney, meticulously checking the marriage contract, trusts, property deeds, and succession clauses. Each paragraph, each phrase was scrutinized for loopholes and overlooked opportunities. The family had relied on assumptions, on outdated beliefs about inheritance, on the idea that a woman marrying into the family could never possess true authority. I had anticipated this. Every clause they had neglected, every technicality they dismissed, became a potential lever in my hands. Next came the financial review. I analyzed the estate's accounts, investments, and property portfolios. The family had made decisions based on incomplete knowledge, assuming that the assets were out of my reach. Yet, every account they managed, every property they controlled, had a record that linked back to joint investments, shared management, or prior agreements. These subtle traces of my involvement were enough to establish undeniable influence, and I intended to make the most of it. While the groundwork was legal and financial, the psychological strategy was just as important. I studied the family's routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. My father-in-law, confident in his authority, was predictable in his rigidity. My mother-in-law, ever concerned with appearances, was susceptible to social embarrassment and public scrutiny. Cousins, siblings, and other relatives had patterns of reaction I could anticipate. Understanding these dynamics was crucial. Revenge in its purest form is not chaotic. It is precise, surgical, and psychologically impactful. I spent days constructing a timeline. Each step of the plan was mapped with exact precision, from the sequence of meetings to the presentation of legal evidence. The order in which revelations were disclosed would determine the emotional impact. Timing was everything. A well-executed plan could turn arrogance into shock, condescension into acknowledgement. I imagined each reaction in vivid detail, rehearsing my tone, my posture, and my expressions. The power of anticipation, the subtle shift from passive to assertive, would amplify the final effect. Simultaneously, I cultivated allies outside the family. Legal experts, financial consultants, and property managers became my quiet confidants. Each was briefed on specific details, instructed on timing, and sworn to discretion. I could not risk premature leaks or accidental exposure. The plan relied on complete surprise. Their expertise complemented my own knowledge and added layers of credibility and authority to my eventual presentation. One evening, I walked through the estate, envisioning the confrontation. The grand hall, lined with portraits of ancestors, symbolized the family's history and assumed dominance. I imagined each family member frozen, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and forced composure, as I calmly revealed my claims. Every overlooked property, every investment I had made, every trace of authority I had quietly accrued would be presented in a single, unassailable narrative. There were moments of doubt, fleeting, yet persistent. Could I manage the confrontation without succumbing to emotion? Could I maintain control when their defenses crumbled? These questions were tempered by the knowledge that preparation was my greatest weapon. I had rehearsed every scenario, anticipated every objection, and fortified my confidence with facts, evidence, and the psychological edge that comes from years of underestimation. The first strategic move was subtle. I began attending estate meetings under the guise of mourning and deference. I asked questions that seemed innocuous, but subtly revealed my awareness and expertise. I noted inconsistencies in their planning and discreetly corrected errors in tone, fact, or procedure. The family interpreted these interventions as cautious curiosity, not realizing that I was gathering ammunition while shaping perceptions to my advantage. The second move involved my public and professional persona. I strengthened my visibility in the business world, quietly ensuring that the family's social and financial networks recognized my competence and authority. Subtle public mentions of my management experience, media features, and professional accolades began to circulate among mutual acquaintances. This was psychological groundwork. They would begin to sense that my influence extended beyond the estate, yet they remained confident that they held the reins of power within the family domain. By the third week, my planning was near completion. I had documented every asset, every legal leverage point, and every social and psychological angle. I had rehearsed my presentation, refined my speech, and anticipated counterarguments. I had transformed every slight, every insult, and every assumption against me into a roadmap for victory. On the evening before the confrontation, I sat alone in the study, reviewing notes and visualizing the moment of truth. Each breath, each gesture, each carefully chosen word would carry the weight of years of planning and the force of undeniable authority. I imagined the faces of my father-in-law, mother-in-law, and relatives as they realized that their assumptions had been flawed. The knowledge that they had underestimated me fueled a calm, focused intensity. I also prepared for contingencies. Should any relative attempt to challenge my claims, I had meticulously documented evidence to validate my position. Should they try to dismiss my authority, I had already ensured that outside witnesses and professionals were ready to confirm my rightful place. Every eventuality had a solution. Every risk had been mitigated. Finally, I considered the emotional dimension. I knew that my approach had to balance assertiveness with composure. Anger or vindictiveness would diminish the impact of the revelation. Calm, precise, and confident delivery would magnify it. Every detail of my demeanor, every subtle inflection, every well-timed pause was rehearsed to maximize clarity and authority. The night passed in restless anticipation. I barely slept, instead reviewing, rehearsing, and internalizing the plan. By dawn, I was prepared. The culmination of months of strategy, study, and patience had arrived. The moment when their assumptions would collide with reality was imminent. As I stood before the grand estate, ready to step into the room that symbolized their power and my careful preparation, a sense of calm clarity settled over me. This was not about revenge in the ordinary sense. This was about recognition, justice, and the undeniable assertion of truth. The family's confidence, built on underestimation and arrogance, would meet the meticulous precision of preparation. The moment had arrived. I was ready to turn the tables, to claim what was rightfully mine, and to do so with the grace, poise, and authority that years of careful planning had bestowed. The day of reckoning arrived with a quiet intensity. I dressed with meticulous care, choosing an ensemble that projected authority without ostentation. A custom-tailored suit in deep charcoal, paired with understated jewelry. The clothing was symbolic. I would enter their domain not as a supplicant, but as someone whose presence demanded attention and respect. Every detail, from my posture to my gaze, had been rehearsed over countless nights of preparation. As I stepped into the estate, the familiar hallways felt different. They were no longer spaces of exclusion and judgment. They were stages upon which every calculated move of my plan would unfold. The family, confident in their assumed dominance, greeted me with measured politeness. Their smiles were polite but faintly condescending, their glances appraising but dismissive. They still believed they controlled the narrative. I waited until the room was full, the subtle hum of conversation masking the tension I had carefully orchestrated. Then I spoke, my voice calm but firm. "I have something to discuss with everyone," I said, letting the words settle into the room. A ripple of curiosity passed through the attendees, their expressions a mix of surprise and mild irritation. I began with the facts, clear, precise, and undeniable. I outlined the legal aspects of my claim, detailing the marriage contract, the trusts, and the property deeds. Each point was presented with evidence, documentation, and professional validation. The family's attempts at interruption were met with calm, unwavering responses. Every objection was anticipated, every argument countered, every misjudgment gently but firmly corrected. Their disbelief became palpable. My father-in-law's face, once confident and commanding, tightened with the realization that the assumptions on which he had based his authority were flawed. My mother-in-law's carefully constructed composure faltered, her eyes darting between documents and the reactions of the other family members. Cousins and siblings, who had relied on my supposed ignorance, whispered nervously, unsure how to respond. I watched as the shift occurred. Authority, once assumed by birthright and tradition, began to flow toward me. The evidence was unassailable, the logic unbroken, and the presentation impeccable. I had not just prepared for legal victory. I had prepared for psychological impact, for the moment when arrogance met reality, and it was working. Then came the personal element. I spoke of my late husband, of my contributions to the family estate, and of the years spent ensuring that every asset, every investment, and every property had been managed responsibly. I reminded them that my involvement had never been passive, that my presence had always been integral, even when they refused to acknowledge it. The emotional weight of these words was subtle but undeniable, forcing recognition of not just my legal standing, but my rightful place within the family. I revealed the final piece, an announcement that left the room in stunned silence. Certain properties, previously thought to revert automatically to blood relatives, were already under my control, legally validated through prior agreements and careful oversight. Their attempts to assert dominance crumbled under the weight of irrefutable proof. Every assumption, every casual dismissal, every underestimation had been meticulously dismantled. The reactions were a mixture of shock, anger, and forced acknowledgement. My father-in-law slumped into his chair, his face pale, his voice catching as he attempted to articulate a response. My mother-in-law's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table, realizing that her careful planning and presumed authority had been neutralized. Cousins and siblings exchanged looks of disbelief, suddenly aware that their confidence had been misplaced. I allowed a brief pause, letting the silence reinforce the impact. This was not about gloating. It was about clarity. I had prepared for this moment to ensure that recognition was inescapable, that the truth of my authority, knowledge, and rightful claims was undeniable. Then, with calm precision, I concluded the presentation. All of these matters are legally and rightfully under my direction, I said, letting each word resonate. I understand this may be difficult to accept, but it is the truth. Every asset, every property, every investment that I have detailed is within my authority. I have acted with responsibility, diligence, and respect for the estate. And now, I simply ask for recognition. The room remained still, the weight of reality settling over each person. They had assumed control through tradition and expectation. Yet the meticulous preparation, strategic patience, and unwavering resolve I had demonstrated could not be dismissed. The authority that had once seemed to reside solely with them had quietly shifted, and it was undeniable. I moved through the room deliberately, acknowledging each family member by name, making eye contact, and projecting a calm yet commanding presence. This was not theatrics. It was the natural culmination of months of planning, research, and quiet strategy. The psychological impact, the slow recognition that their assumptions had been wrong, was as important as the legal validation itself. Finally, I allowed a moment of personal closure. I addressed my late husband, speaking softly yet clearly. I have honored your legacy and protected what is ours. Everything we built together, everything you entrusted to me, has been safeguarded. The words were both a tribute and a declaration, reinforcing the depth of my connection and the responsibility I carried. The aftermath was subtle but profound. Conversations shifted from dismissal to acknowledgement, from condescension to tentative respect. Family members who had previously underestimated me began to ask questions, seek guidance, and recognize the authority I wielded with quiet confidence. I did not celebrate. I simply allowed the recognition to settle. The impact was complete, precise, and enduring. As the day drew to a close, I stood alone in the estate's central hall, reflecting on the journey, the struggle, the sleepless nights, the meticulous planning, and the careful execution had culminated in a moment that was both personal and strategic. Every slight, every underestimation, every dismissal had been transformed into a catalyst for recognition and rightful authority. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a profound sense of peace. Justice had not been served through anger or recklessness, but through clarity, precision, and unwavering resolve. The family had been forced to acknowledge the truth, not as a concession, but as an inescapable reality. And in that stillness, I understood that power, authority, and respect are not inherited. They are earned, and when carefully pursued, they cannot be denied. The room that had once symbolized exclusion and judgment was now a space of acknowledgement and recognition. I had claimed what was mine, not through confrontation alone, but through strategy, patience, and unwavering determination. The family could no longer ignore my presence, influence, or rightful authority. The story did not end with vindication, it ended with clarity. I had transformed adversity into empowerment, underestimation into recognition, and exclusion into acknowledgement. Every step of the journey, from grief to strategic preparation to ultimate execution, had reinforced a single truth. Respect must be earned, and it cannot be fabricated through assumptions or tradition alone. As I left the estate that evening, I carried with me not only the satisfaction of victory, but the deeper understanding that true authority is a combination of knowledge, patience, and strategic action. The family would remember this day, not for resentment or anger, but for the undeniable demonstration of what it means to claim rightful power with grace, precision, and unwavering resolve. As I stepped away from the estate that evening, the weight of months of planning and sleepless nights lifted from my shoulders. It was not about vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was about recognition, respect, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I realized that life will often place obstacles, underestimations, and dismissive judgments in your path. But it is in those moments that resilience, patience, and strategy transform frustration into empowerment. Justice is rarely instant, but when earned through careful action and unwavering focus, it becomes undeniable. Looking back, I understood that the pain I endured, the dismissals, the condescension, the assumptions about my incapacity, was never wasted. It sharpened me, it prepared me, and it made the eventual triumph all the more meaningful. True power lies not in confrontation alone, but in the calm precision with which one claims what is rightfully theirs. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, you know how satisfying it feels to claim your rightful place. Hit the like button if you love stories of empowerment and justice. Share this video so others can witness how patience, strategy, and determination can turn the tables. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where courage meets vindication.